and welcome to an impromptu stream that may or may not go so well due to the fact I am running this alone. But I thought it would be a good time to share some information that I have regarding current events because I haven't seen it anywhere else. I don't think it will have the time to get to it on Week in Review because, as those of you who tune in regularly to the show may have realized, we're trying to take it in a more serious direction. And what I'm going to do today is mostly punditry. So I don't want to basically crowd out Week in Review with that. We'll open up with a little clip of what's going on 4chan these days. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching that as much as I enjoyed making it. Thank you so much for those of you who already tuned in. I see Laramie Hirsch had a question in the chat. Is it just me, or is there a lot of cannibalism on the right? I think you're right that these larger social movements kind of come with a lot of, I suppose you could call it infighting. I don't know, because I try to keep myself as far away from that as possible, so I'm not really in the thick of it. I know I can be a touch controversial, but I do move to quash the bad vibes as quickly as I can. So Laramie elaborates to say backstabbing, calumny, catty gossip, gaslighting, and so on. I see it on the right in our circles, as well as in some of my religio-political circles. Well, I think you have a point there, Laramie, honestly. I was actually in a convo, just a private convo with our mutual friend, Davis Serini, the other day. He's a great guy. We got a chance to talk about a lot of stuff and some projects he's interested in. That'll overlap actually a little bit with what I want to talk about today, because we are eventually going to get to the oil, well, the combination of the price dropping and this conflict that's emerging from Saudi Arabia and Russia. Probably all heard about it by now, that there's been a massive drop in the I got already some people saying hi in the chat who are probably possibly not interested in what I have to say, but more in trolling. But yeah, just to get to what you're saying, I'm not a big fan of the cattiness, but it happens because I find this is just how people close ranks in social circles. Like, it's almost like there's, I think you could probably trace it back to the, what do you call it? It's the rules for radicals. There you go. Saul Alinsky, rules for radicals. So this had a lot of influence on the culture, and it still would be leaders with a certain ideology, I think. And the way that they lead is kind of through this dividing, whether they realize it's divisive or not, I'm not sure, but they do tend to close ranks in a particularly underhanded way. I know because it's happened to me several times. Being a content producer for quite a while, even before I was on YouTube, I did a fair bit of work on Facebook there, just talking to people in debate groups. And there's always people that are kind of, I don't want to say they're paid shells, but they're like hobbyists at the very least. They're very interested in not just the memes, but also the people promoting the memes. So they will try to isolate you, I think, in order to maintain their own influence. So they don't want people basically having any collectivism that they aren't in charge of. So they'll move to divide and conquer really any way that they can. So thanks, Thomas, for that. Cleaning up the chat there. I really appreciate the people who contribute positively to the chat. It's awesome. But yeah, I think Arini is a pretty level-headed guy. He's interested in some stuff that I'm interested in. We like I said, had a bit of a chat, and hopefully we can move forward with some type of semi-social, semi-infotainment type of network where these backstabbing, underhanded problems aren't really an issue. And I think when people are clear from the get-go what their expectations are, it's very easy to avoid drama. because I don't deal with drama very much directly. I tend to be just interested in quashing it, and in so doing, kind of make it obvious who's into the scene for purposes of shit stirring versus just into the scene for the right reasons. Unfortunately, the shit stirrers, they do outnumber the people who are legitimate. However, there's they're not too useful, even though they are higher in numbers. So, sorry about that. I'm still getting used to what I'm up to here. I'm not even sure where I've got this stored. But yeah, I wanted to talk about the coronavirus and just give people some ideas. It has been declared a pandemic, so the threat level has been escalated. We still can't really be sure what exactly is going on with this, because it does become very difficult to validate evidence at a certain point when you're dealing with stuff on the internet. I used to work in evidence processing myself, and really, if you can't validate the chain of custody, you're not really sure what you're looking at. But we can be reasonably certain that, well, I guess we can't be reasonably certain about much. It has been declared an outbreak. Trump has spoken on it, just gave a brief address, and where he stated that restricting travel from Europe may be necessary. NBA has suspended its season after a player has contracted the virus. Italy seems to be a bit further ahead in terms of a lockdown, possibly due to higher numbers of fatalities. It looks like all non-essential businesses have been ordered to close down, as well as the stocks are taking a beating. Apparently, Tom Hanks, as he and his wife have the coronavirus. Desperate ploy for attention or legitimate illness, only time will tell. So I just wanted to give a little bit of advice to people. I mean, I know everyone's saying don't panicking. Claire's got her streams going where she's in a very agitated voice telling people not to panic. I don't want to say what to do to people. I'll just tell you what I'm doing. I'm avoiding unnecessary trips and contact with other people, and what people could do just to avoid getting sick in the first place. So I know there has been conflicting reports about whether vitamin C can be used to diminish the potential of getting this illness / speed up the recovery. So there's, again, conflicting reports, but we do have a study that's actually being undertaken here, vitamin C infusion for the treatment of severe 2019 nCoV infected pneumonia. So thought this was a bit interesting. The summary of the study says that 2019 new coronavirus infected pneumonia, namely severe acute respiratory infection, has caused global concern and emergency. There's a lack of effective targeting antiviral drugs, and symptomatic supportive treatment is still the current main treatment. Vitamin C is significant to the human body. It plays a role in reducing inflammatory response and preventing common cold. In addition, a few studies have shown that vitamin C deficiency is related to increased risk and severity of influenza infections. So they've hypothesized that vitamin C infusion can help improve the prognosis of patients with this coronavirus. Now, this may not actually be the coronavirus, but it's one family of viruses. So it's not going to hurt to take maybe 200 milligrams of vitamin C a day. At the very least, you won't hurt yourself. Another thing people can do, they don't exactly know how this is spreading, but they are reasonably certain that it has a higher contagion rate. So you can do some things to help yourself lower that chance of contraction. One idea is to just stop shaving, because what shaving does is can possibly introduce little cuts to the skin. And if this thing can be, I'm not sure if it can be transmitted through the skin, but you don't want to be cutting your skin unnecessarily. So I would suggest people stop shaving, as well as plucking their bodily hair, until we have more information and things are getting safer. Another thing you could do is use a soap that's not so harsh on the skin. Now, I like to make a mixture of coconut oil and sodium bicarbonate. which is commonly known as baking soda. So the way that that works is actually better than, in my opinion, better than regular soap, because what regular soap does is it removes the dirt, but it also removes a protective layer that you have. So especially at times like this, it's good to keep that protective layer. We got Laramie Hirsch in the chat saying he believes the coronavirus will be at a scary point in a month. The peak will be in November. And he wants to know if I think it will be possible. Do I think it's possible it's a bioweapon meant to disrupt the November elections? Well, there's evidence that suggests it is a bioweapon, or at least was a bioweapon. Like there's sort of two questions there. Was it a bioweapon, and was it deployed intentionally? So I suppose the fact that it lines up a little bit with the timing of the election is suspicious. I don't think that's quite enough to go on. But yeah, it's definitely something to monitor, because I saw something recently on social media talking about these crazy flus that had happened all in the year, like 17, 20, 18, 20, 19, 20, and 2020. So I thought that was a strange coincidence that people, you know the way that people could be on the internet sometimes seeing patterns that aren't there. But my opinion at this point is, yeah, it's probably biologically engineered, but it's not clear to me whether it was released intentionally. Don Robertson is suggesting to move to northern Canada. Couldn't the beard collect the virus on your face? Well, I understand that's a concern. That's why it's important not to touch your face, and to be like, when you get back from being out in public, or if you could have come in contact with someone that would have been infected, to wash. But we have to think back, Donald, to what's the point? Why do we have hair in the first place? And it is to keep things away from us. So even if it gets stuck in the hair, that's better than it getting stuck in your respiratory tract. And when you get home, you just wash off as best you can. Like I say, I make a mixture of coconut oil and baking soda so that it's mixed to the point where if you don't get the right ratio, then there'll be a segment of just pure coconut oil in it. So you want to add enough baking soda that's saturated, and then you just use that as basically a bodily soap. It works really well for me. It works better than normal soap, and it doesn't deplete that natural layer of oil that's really helpful for you. So I'll play a video just explaining how that works, and then we'll continue with our show.
The bicarbonate buffer system. Blood is maintained at a narrow range of pH, which is between 7.35 and 7.45. Serious problems result from blood that is too acidic or alkaline. Abnormal pH can lead to coma and death. One of the ways by which the body maintains the blood pH is through buffers. The most important buffer in the blood is the bicarbonate ion buffer. Before we see how it works, let's review a little bit about acids and bases. Acids are molecules that tend to give up hydrogen ions. For example, hydrochloric acid dissociates into hydrogen ions and chloride ions. As a solution's hydrogen ion concentration increases, its pH goes down, making the solution more acidic. Bases tend to combine with hydrogen ions, neutralizing them to form water. For example, sodium hydroxide dissociates into sodium and hydroxyl groups. The hydroxyl ion combines with the hydrogen ion, neutralizing it. As a solution's hydrogen ion concentration decreases, its pH goes up, making the solution more alkaline. If there are too many hydrogen ions, or an increase in hydrogen ion concentration in the blood, the bicarbonate ion combines with the hydrogen ion to form carbonic acid. If there are too few hydrogen ions, or a decrease in hydrogen ion concentration, carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions, thereby increasing the hydrogen ion concentration. We can use this equation to illustrate how an increase in hydrogen ion concentration, or acidosis, causes the reaction to move toward the left, which promotes the formation of carbonic acid. Likewise, a decrease in hydrogen ion concentration, or alkalosis, causes the reaction to move to the right, promoting the dissociation of carbonic acid into hydrogen and bicarbonate ions. In addition to buffer systems, the respiratory system also works to maintain pH. For example, if blood becomes too acidic, respiration rate increases in order to rid the body of carbon dioxide. A subsequent decrease in hydrogen ions occurs. Likewise, if blood becomes too alkaline, respiration rate decreases in order to increase the hydrogen ion concentration. You could say that hydrogen ion concentration follows carbon dioxide concentration. I hope you've learned something about the bicarbonate ion buffer, and see you next time.
All right, so hopefully that was helpful for people. Now, we've got John 7 in the chat saying he doesn't understand the acid-base thing. So the important thing about acid bases is that an acid has too many hydrogen relative to, because water has the exact balance, right? Water is H2O, so 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. If you split that up, you get a hydrogen ion, and what they call, I think it's a hydroxyl group. It's OH negative and H positive. So the more H positive you have, the more acidic a solution is. And that's what pH comes in. pH means the power of hydronium, which is basically how many more times of water, because water spontaneously has a tiny amount of H plus and OH minus that disassociates it, which is 10 to the negative 7. So 1 in every 10 million water molecules will spontaneously dissolve into this ion pair. That's just naturally how it happens. That's like why we need water for life, is because it has this inner chemical activity that kind of facilitates everything else. Obviously, we also need carbon, but that's another story. So the key thing to understand here is that water breaks down into 2 things. One, if there's an excess of H plus, you get acidic. And then on the other end, if there's an excess of OH minus, you get basic. And the more of an excess you have relative to water, the more acidic or basic a substance is. And our bodies have very, very thin pH ranges in which they're meant to operate. Okay, that's a very important thing to remember. Just like in the video, how I was saying that the rate of breathing will be increased when there's conditions that are too acidic, so that the body has a self-regulatory mechanism. So what washing with bicarbonate / coconut oil will do is allow your skin to absorb what's called a bicarbonate buffer. And a bicarbonate buffer basically can serve to donate either H plus or OH minus, depending on what your body needs. Your body's very intelligent. It'll just take whatever it needs if there's a buffer solution present. That's why if you're feeling a little bit brave, you can attempt what's called a baking soda enema, which is a little bit more advanced of a technique, but it can really help with your, because what it does is rinse out the colon, which allows for the passing of this bicarbonate buffer into the blood, basically directly. And it's pretty much adjacent to the lungs as well, so it can help to clear out the lungs. And basically, if you give your body this buffer, it'll just take what it needs from it. So it can be very cleansing. Again, don't do this if you have no experience. And if you have no experience, make sure you talk to someone who has experience, because there are some dangers with enemas, namely people not putting any salt in them, because you want your enemas to have the same saline content as blood. That's very important. Otherwise, you'll get a net movement of saline, of salt, across the boundary, which is the intestinal wall, which you don't want. Very painful. Want to avoid that at all costs. All right, so we wanted to talk a little bit. So I guess that pretty much wraps it up for coronavirus. Again, do what you can to avoid unnecessary contact. Don't, if you can, like they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So it's very important to be mentally healthy, because ultimately that's what takes care of your body. So Laramie's asking if I'm enjoying KMG's new show. Yeah, it's I watch it sometimes. I think I prefer Luke, because there's something about Luke. So he's a bit neurotic, and he's got a pretty dry sense of humor. I like that about him. Kevin's a little bit more of a black pillar, sort of cynical guy with a sharp sense of humor characteristic. of of the Irish. I believe he's half Irish, so he's got his appeal. I liked him better with Luke, to be honest, even though that eventually went sour. But I guess all in all, I tune in occasionally, but I'm still probably more of a fan of Luke's than Kevin's. And what do I think his appeal is? I think he's just reminiscent of the old school mainstream conservative radio and TV programs, basically. That's pretty much what I think about it. So yeah, we can move on to another topic. Talk a little bit about the markets. So I'll play a little. I've been checking out. I normally check out 4chan for the politically incorrect board, but I went on over to Biz to see what that was like, and I'll show you guys what I found there. And we're back. Hope everyone enjoyed that. I sure did. So yeah, it was a bit funny to see. I mean, I think there's probably as much BS there as there is on Poll, but it's a slightly different flavor. The cultural vibe of Poll seems to have moved over to Biz. I don't know if that's Poll bleeding into Biz or just Poll bleeding into real life. Not exactly sure. Don't really don't really get out that much enough to know. All right, so I wanted to take a look at the effects that this was having on the market. We seem to have this very strange timing between this coronavirus as well as the cost of a barrel of oil going down due to this conflict. So I just wanted to draw people's attention to the fact that they are predicting massive losses here for the tourism industry, which is sort of important, right? I mean, we've got WTTC.org saying that travel and tourism grew at 3.9% to contribute a record 8.8 trillion and 9.13 million jobs to the world economy in 2018. So by my calculations, that's about 9.5% of the global economy. So that's a pretty serious chunk if you think about people self-isolating, quarantining, etc. That's going to put a dent in travel and tourism. And if that's 10% of the global economy, that is not great news. So a lot of opportunities in there, but at the same time, people do need to buckle down for tough times. So Thomas hasn't been feeling too good lately. Hope you're all right. Hope you haven't gotten any illnesses. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about what was going on with this price of oil thing, because it appeared to happen quite quickly. We had this situation of talks with OPEC basically going south, and then all of a sudden Saudi Arabia basically revenge pumping the economy, flooding it with cheaper oil, which caused a massive drop in the prices. So what we have here are the price of crude oil prices, 70-year historical chart. Now, note that these numbers have been increased, or sorry, they've been adjusted for inflation. So this is keeping the inflation in mind. We've got numbers going back all the way to the 50s. So it's interesting to see how we haven't really had much. I mean, there hasn't really been much of a increase in price, which if we're supposedly facing this peak oil thing, which seems increasingly dubious as these shenanigans with political oil plays seem to increase. Just take a look at the history of this. You're basically looking at a situation where since the 70s, there's been no net increase in the cost of crude oil. What we do have in the meantime is some massive increase, which sort of led to basically a almost indiscernible pattern. So we have our 1973 oil crisis. Members of the Organization of the Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries proclaimed an oil embargo. So that's what you're looking at over here. So you see the effect that it can have going from 21 to 54 per barrel and really not coming back anywhere near that level for quite some time. And then I suppose another speculative bubble and leading to a collapse right around 2015 there. And who knows where this is going, but this is certainly telling me that there's a bit of a disconnect between the supply and the demand. And that makes me think that maybe, just maybe, this stuff is a renewable resource after all. So if people want to read more, they can look this up on Wikipedia, but basically it's going to be an explanation of what led to this massive increase. And then you had the 1980s oil glut, which again decoupled supply and demand. So it's definitely something to look at. And I'm going to go ahead and speculate in a minute after I cover exactly what's going on from Markets Insider. Russia and Saudi Arabia are preparing for a lengthy oil price war after OPEC and negotiations fell through and sparked an all-out sprint for market share. All right, so for those of you who don't know, basically oil markets are pegged to the petrodollar. And this is how the U.S. more or less maintains its fiscal and therefore military hegemony. So this sort of thing happening is a sign that the U.S. is not being taken as seriously abroad. Just the fact that Saudi Arabia was willing to do this escalated the conflict on Tuesday, saying it would boost production to a record 12.3 million barrels per day starting April 1st. So again, not really sounding like they are worried about running out. Russia apparently fired back within minutes by hiking its planned output by 500,000 barrels per day. Pretty impressive. Initial strikes over the weekend pushed oil's price down by the most since 1991. So we're talking like nearly 30 years there of increase of price just wiped out. Optimism from Moscow could be driving mild recovery in Tuesday's session. So I don't know how old this is, but the markets appear to have taken another beating today. Doesn't appear to be a bottom in sight for the price of this stuff because there's just never really been a coupling between price and demand. I mean, it's very strange. It really does suggest that this is a renewable resource that is just being throttled in order to keep the prices high. So this is from CNBC Markets is a couple days ago. Jim Cramer says you could see 9 or 10 oil companies going bankrupt if the crude declines persist. So this is definitely something to look at. Possible investment potential for some of these companies. Because as we can see, I'll pull up. All right, I had this up earlier, but I'll bring it up again. If I want to have a look at the BP, that's a major oil company. Have a look at its progress over the last 5 years. So up, bit of a crash here, 2016 going down to mid 300s, but now it's below even that. So may represent a buying opportunity, especially if the company is quote unquote too big to fail. Something for people to look into if they're interested in high risk investing. So I'm not the first person to say this possibility that oil and gas are actually renewable. All right, got someone in the chat back in NASA. Not sure who you are, bud, but nice to see you again. Hey, King Kush. And unless they rip you off, they're out of business. Well, that's definitely true. There's definitely, it's a rigged game. It's not impossible to make money off of it, but it is largely, these investments are largely a rigged game. I certainly don't support the stock market. I'm just trying to get people to make the best decisions that they have they can with the information that they have. So this is a pretty standard pattern here if people are interested how this works. So we got a valuation chart for stocks. Usually smart money gets in before these things are even public so that they won't have a very high value. Awareness phase, there'll be a tiny bit of people investing, but not much. And then there'll be a first sell-off, which will lower the price, but then it'll really explode. And then you see your bull trap coming along after the quote new paradigm, which is actually just a massive decoupling based on speculative, what they call the mania phase, where the public starts to buy in because they think it's easy money. And then you have your sort of dead cat mounts here where it's like, yeah, everything's going fine. Oh my God, no. Okay, I have to sell my kids on the black market. And then blow off phase, return to the mean. So the idea with these stocks is you can pretty much expect them to go up. They usually do better than inflation, at least for, the times when it's stable. They are better than inflation, but you kind of have to have a stomach that can tolerate a bit of fluctuation in your overall valuation, because it is quite a bloodbath out there, or can be. Lambie says to buy the dip. Yeah, I've heard a lot all over 4chan there, Biz talking about buying the dip. It's really hard to know because you can look at this and think, well, yeah, this is basically guaranteed. This is a guaranteed investment here. But what if things go back down to pre-1990s levels? We really have no idea, because it kind of seems like there's way more oil coming out of Saudi Arabia than anywhere else. So they could basically control the market to a degree that would decouple these stocks from any sense of sanity. The only thing we can really be sure about right now is that the value of these stocks for BP and other companies like it is largely tied to the value of these crude oil prices. So I'm not the first person to say this. Oil and gas are possibly actually renewable. So it's definitely something to look at. If this is the case, we should probably be looking at things a little bit differently. At least that's how I look at it, because fracking can be quite bad for the environment. It destroys arable land that could probably be used for something better, especially if Canada's going to be getting all this global warming. Maybe it's a better idea to farm some of that land than just turn it into toxic swamps. But hey, that's just my 2 cents. So a good thought experiment. If it is a renewable resource, what should we do about it? That's something to think about. How would this work exactly? How could oil be a renewable resource? Well, you just have to think about what's going on the planet exactly. How the Earth's, I guess you could call it geomagnetics, not exactly sure. Right. So Donald Robertson is saying it's renewable in 200 million years. Yeah. Now you're assuming it comes from dead dinosaurs, right? How do we know that, though? Because what are we talking about here? It's a pretty simple chemical, right? This that they're pulling out, this crude oil, is a simple hydrocarbon. We live in a very active planet. So it is possible that through the cycling that's going on under the surface of the planet, again, this is kind of a big question mark as to what's going on under the surface of the planet. There's this theory that talks about tectonic plates, but I suspect that is not quite how it works, and that the inside of the planet is actually closer to a liquid than a solid. So if you've got something cycling around and all this solar energy coming in and all this inner energy from the center of the planet, why couldn't it produce renewable hydrocarbons? Now, if this is the case, we're kind of looking at a different question, because then we have to start answering questions like, well, should we be rationing this stuff? Should we be taking into consideration the fact that releasing all this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere could ultimately lead the ocean to have problems with its own buffer, i.e. acidification of the ocean, which is what leads to the bleaching of these, the word escapes me now, but it's underwater. I believe they're called coral reefs. So it's something to think about, because this is a source of a lot of conflict. And if this is actually renewable resources, probably want to think about it in a slightly different way. But basically, you can kind of look at how the seafloor, there's definitely a recognizable pattern there. So basically what's happening is this landmass and this landmass are getting closer to each other. And the proof that they're getting closer to each other is that this mountain here is forming. So think of it like a pimple. You know, this continent's pushing that way. This guy's pushing that way. And then you got this like crack here in the middle, which is actually the top of a sub-oceanic mountain. And at the same time, you have it pulling, right? Because if it's pushing that way, it's also pulling this way. So you have all this generalized pressure sort of building up between the continents. It doesn't stand to reason that there would be somewhere to release this pressure, and possibly with subterranean materials, which could include this crude oil. Now, what happens if we have a look here? You got something kind of unique going on here, which is where a lot of this oil is coming from, right? You have this enormous pressure region. You have a very high level as well as a very low level. And you see that going on as well over here, almost like a hole where things are getting super deep, because blue is super deep. So anywhere that happens, there's pressure. And so the pressure could be being relieved by the release of these renewable crude oil or crude oil type liquids. It's just something to think about. I'm not sure if it's true or not. I don't know. I have no way of validating this, but it seems reasonable enough, especially if we look at this. I mean, arguably, it's an insane decoupling, right? Like this, you know what I mean? Like this doesn't appear to follow any rational pattern. And if this thing was non-renewable, there'd probably be some sort of observable supply-demand effects, and we're just not seeing that. How's it going, Tretch? Nice to see you. See, everybody's enjoying the graph. I'm glad. Yeah, so Donald says carbon gets buried under the moving tectonic plates. The reality is, Donald, I don't think you know how crude oil is supposed to form. And let's be realistic. Like, it's not a very complicated molecule. If the molecules that comprise proteins, which are amino acids, could arise spontaneously on Earth, and we know they did because life's here now, why couldn't crude oil? Why don't we look up what crude oil actually is? What is the chemical composition of crude oil? And we'll have a look and see how complicated it is. I believe it has 8 carbons, but I'm not 100% sure, so I want to look it up. It's been a while. It's been a while since university chemistry there. All right, so this looks like the answer might be a little more complicated than I thought. It's not just popping up as the first answer there. So sorry, I should have researched this earlier. All right. I'm not finding it. I'm sorry. I'll have to look it up during a break here. But yeah, we got carbon dioxide, methane. That's what you call a natural gas. Also have propane's another form of natural gas. And heptane, sweet crude oil. Okay, again, it's not really telling me what sweet crude oil is. But let's see here. I'm actually surprised at how hard it is to find just the regular chemical composition of this thing. I guess it must be a mixture of different things, which again, they're not very complicated hydrocarbons, under 10 carbons. So there's really no reason that this couldn't form spontaneously. It's just something to think about. I'm not saying I'm taking a position one way or the other. I'm just saying it's something to think about. People should be open-minded, because who knows? Maybe we'll find out that it is renewable through all these crazy political muscle flexes going on that end up doxing information. Yeah. So Donald says carbon plus pressure equals diamonds, right? So there's a tremendous amount of action potentials going on underground. So we really cannot be sure, can we? And again, saying that it forms from dead organic matter, you have no way of proving that, do you, Donald? That's just a hypothesis, isn't it? So I don't think it's a good idea to jump to conclusions. Maybe it's actually just caused by this churning sub-oceanic currents. I mean, all you need is really carbon, and carbon obviously exists here free from life. Yeah, I'm aware that all petrochemicals are extracted from crude oil, Donald. What I was trying to get was the actual chemical composition, just to show you guys how simple chemically this stuff is. But because it's a mixture of various hydrocarbons, I'm not getting like a set formula coming up. So I'll replay a little video here while I go actually look up the formula, and I'll have a good laugh at ConOps, one of the biggest douchebags I've ever met.
You up. Yeah, but Dude, I like Duvid. Duvid doesn't really
Yeah.
piss me off, you know.
No, but dude, Duvid is basically a white nationalist with a hook nose.
Oh well. You know, military.
It's rather interesting. I was at Sarah's channel or something, or Jenny's channel or something. I was talking to Jenny, and Jenny has this theory now about how the Earth and the Moon became as they are today. So basically, she said there was a huge ice block crashing into Earth, and then what she says is all the water from that ice, like, got on the planet, even though it was liquid magma at the time. But all that ice became sort of on the crust of the how would you say of the planet itself. And I was like, what the hell? Like, she's also making up shit. Like, she can explain it. She says, no, there's no such thing as gravity. Everything is attracted by spheres. Everything just becomes a sphere in the end. I don't know. Like, I mean, she has great ways of trying to explain it, but it's just all this nonsense. But I don't know. It's difficult to, if you're not an expert in these areas, to know what is nonsense and what is not nonsense. And I'm not an expert in buildings and how they work, or even.
And welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for tuning into that little clip video. I've been having fun. Having a lot of fun with OBS as well. Hopefully get some new and exciting things going in the future. Trying out this format because I just like to give my 2 cents on these current events. So yeah, what they pull out of the ground is essentially a mixture of these things, right? Very simple. Very, very simple. It's just carbon with all of its possible bonding sites. For those of you who don't know, carbon has 4 bonding sites. It's just all saturated with hydrogens. And when we burn these, we're breaking, we're breaking these bonds essentially. So that's about all I wanted to say on that topic. Very interesting things going on. Good opportunity for research. A lot of unexplored things because like these models are basically changing all the time. They don't really know, and there's stuff coming out all the time where they're basically saying they have to reinvent their models because what they thought was operating beneath the surface of the Earth was actually way off. But my position at this point is the default hypothesis is that crude oil is a renewable resource and we should think about things in that sense. So a little bit of something topical that I enjoy that came out pretty recently, March 11th, 2020 there. So it's a very interesting theory about what exactly is going on up in the night sky, which appears to be consistent with my theory as it basically, they're calling it slime mold. I don't think I would have chosen those exact words. I call it dark matter, or the ds equals 0 state, the universal ds equals 0 state. So that's basically the universal highest state of entropy. And they're calling it slime mold and they're doing simulations on this to see whether this array, this model of dark matter and the universe, cosmological model, can make the predictions we observe. And it appears to make the predictions. And they're saying it's slimy because it does move around slightly under the force of its own gravity. So the fact that it's in the maximum entropy state basically means that the only force acting on it is gravity. Because if the electricity force could operate on it, it would not be in the maximum entropy state. So this state doesn't even have an electric differential. You can think of it as essentially a neutronic soup. So it looks like they've finally taken into account the fractal nature of the universe and said that the behavior of one of nature's humblest creatures is helping astronomers probe the largest structures in the universe. So it looks like they're using slime mold, the way that grows naturally as sort of a starting point for a universal model, which is making some of the predictions as they saw fit to publish it in the nasa.gov website. So yeah, I appreciate everybody tuning in. I'll check the chat to see if there's any more questions, or if anyone has any questions, please ask them. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap it up. I just wanted to, have a little chit chat, see how everyone was doing. We got Eternal Entropy in the chat. We observe the operation of a natural refinery of petroleum of gigantic size, they conclude, regarding massive hydrocarbons found in space. I've never seen anything about hydrocarbons in space, but yeah, if you want to put a link to that in the comments, that would be great. I can check it out. And Donald is saying he's pro-nuclear energy. I'm not sure if that's such a great idea, just because of all of the basically toxic pollution that it creates. I would have to take a look at it closer myself, see what's actually available. And again, I think it largely hinges on whether this whether crude oil is renewable or not, because that does change the game quite a bit. Harshit Pant's asking about the state of the Chinese economy. It's really hard to say, because we all know that the Chinese Communist Party does not want to lose face internationally. That would be very bad for them. They have to contend with this idea about the mandate of heaven, a traditional Chinese belief of when the government is no longer fit to rule, that there'll be this chaos, basically indicating that the government's lost the mandate of heaven. So that would be potentially very bad for them. We've got some videos coming out of China of people who are quite in a bad state and complaining that the government's really not doing its job. So they would definitely not want that. That said, it cannot be doing too well, because they have to contend with the fact that they're in a bit of a bind, because we've gone into this global economy where it's basically a race, a race to the bottom with regards to prices. So a company is not going to look at a country with any type of civic loyalty. They're going to say, well, where can I go to get the cheapest labor for whatever it is I want to do? Now, for a while, that was China, aided by the US largely, and a sort of quiet imperialism, both economic and diasporic. If you look at the Chinese diaspora, I believe it's the largest diaspora in the world. Hey, Duvid, nice to see you. Yeah, if you're not busy, I'll send you the link if you want to come in and give your 2 cents. It's always nice to chat with you. I just thought I'd start up the stream. Just I figured I would just hop on and blab a little bit. I know you mentioned I might want to try monologuing. I don't think I'm particularly good at it, but there you go. I had a couple of things I wanted to say about current events. And we got Bub Elvis in the chat. Quasars have been looked at again, and more extensions, giving doubts to dark matter. Yeah, again, it's like, what even is dark matter? Yo, you know what I mean? Like, I've got I can look up a science alert talking about stars forming, basically. So let's have a look here. Clearly, the model of that's based on the Big Bang doesn't really make any sense. So that is sort of like talking about a creator to the universe, not really scientific, more religious thing. So we don't have to contend with a Big Bang. We can basically just say, yeah, we're dealing with an uncreated universe that hasn't always had this particular array, but it's always had these same laws. So whatever laws operate now, have operated forever, because there's essentially no mechanism to change the laws. So we do have evidence that stars are formed from black hole bursts. Again, what is even a black hole, man? What's a black hole versus what is dark matter? I'm not too sure. So again, I'm just calling it the parts you can't see. I call that dark matter or dark mass. Basically, it's the maximum entropy state. That's how I describe it. That's all there is to it. It's the maximum entropy state, i.e. there's no state of lower energy beyond that. So when the energy of a system is exhausted, it returns to this primordial state. And the way to understand the primordial state is just to think of the night sky minus all the stars, everything in the background. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. Welcome to the show, Duvid. Great to have you. How are you doing today? I saw you were streaming with Deshaun before. Why don't you fill us in on whatever's on your mind?
Yeah, so you're talking about some pretty interesting stuff about oil. I just saw you were streaming, checked it out, and saw your little update on the coronavirus and the oil prices, and then talking about whether oil was a renewable resource. That was kind of interesting. Me and Deshaun talked largely about the African American vote and the significance of Biden winning out over Sanders and what that means moving forward. And we were thinking interesting. In terms of what we talk about and we can review often, is that immigration and multiculturalism does not necessarily benefit African Americans, and the liberal platform recently, especially the progressives or the side that Jews are on, favor multiculturalism and more immigration. But the African Americans, who make up almost half of the Democratic Party, do not necessarily benefit from multiculturalism and increased immigration. And you could see that Biden winning out over Sanders might be a sign there that the African American community is not interested in progressivism, and it'll limit the number pushing for progressivism, multiculturalism, possibly down to a smaller faction, while the African Americans attempt for something more mainstream. And that coupled with coronavirus might have interesting implications moving forward. But anyone who wants to check that out, you check out the stream. I used to actually trade oil futures. I know quite a bit about oil. Like, I've read multiple books on it. Just my basic physics background. I took organic chemistry. Like, I started showing the formulas. I think it's Daniel Jurgen, The Prize, and I have his other book. And I used to read periodicals and even have like a certain feel for where all the oil in the world is located and what kinds and the different types and the processes. So, like, I'm not a mineralogist or like an oil engineer, but like, I did trade it for a while. And when I traded it, I spent hours every day for months, just studying it, trying to learn as much as possible about it. And it's interesting also related to the multiple truth hypothesis that one of the first evidence of evolution in old Earth was geology, and still till today, the largest proof on the edge of scientific towards evolution is geology. Just like you mentioned, you could see the continents are moving because of the bulge in the middle of the ocean. And if you make a calculation, like, they're moving so much time a year, and you could see, like, they've been moving for a long time, and it points to the Earth being very, very old. And the geological calculations were the very first ones where you could make like a calculation for how long of a period of time this factor might have occurred. And that's actually the first occurrence of similar, like the multiple truth hypothesis I found was someone working with how do you work with all these geological theories that understand things in a different way. So, where oil comes from, the different processes that form oil, could it be the decomposition of these missing links, like evolution? And so that's usually saying, like, where are all these missing links in evolution? And they say, well, that's our oil, that they just decomposed, and now we're using that for oil. But that's where all the bones and remnants of these missing links and things from the previous epochs exist, and that's mainstream science. And
did you ever run across this renewable crude oil hypothesis when you were trading in it?
No, there's no mainstream believer that oil is renewable, because it's understood, like, or you have organic chemistry and inorganic, and the carbon cycle is understood that carbon is largely exclusive to life, and that life could only, the only source of I did notice that you appeared to say something different, but I think the larger understanding is that no, carbon and life are integrally connected, and there is no inorganic source of carbon.
Well, there would have had to have been if life arose from non-life, then there must be some inorganic source of carbon. I'm thinking carbon dioxide can be resorbed into the ocean, which could cause some type of organic style carbon cycling to happen. I'm surprised that this is a theory, though, that there's no such thing as inorganic carbon. I mean, that's what diamonds are. There's clearly a lot of carbon in the planet because of the existence of diamonds, is there not?
No, I mean, I think carbon. Let me check because it's important.
Like the way I'm thinking of it is, I'm imagining it as like a spectrum between carbon dioxide, which is the least dense, all the way down to carbon as a diamond, which would be the most dense. But you got stuff like graphite that occurs. And so you're saying that the mainstream theory on this is that this all was originally in life. It seems strange because what would make more sense?
The carbon cycle.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so there's various cycles in the carbon cycle. I'm just putting it up here on Wikipedia. Carbons exchange between the biosphere, pedosphere, geosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere. But that the carbon cycle includes life, and that you're saying that there's some reserve of carbon outside of the carbon cycle, and I think that's not the mainstream theory, that you're saying all the carbon's part of the carbon cycle that includes life.
I'm just looking up real quick graphite sources. It is estimated that the world reserves of graphite exceed 800 million tons. That's quite a bit. And that's carbon, I think. I'm pretty sure graphite is carbon.
Oh, yeah, I mean, carbon, it's the sixth most common element in the universe, and the 15th most common one in the Earth's crust. So it can't just be connected to life, but I guess the division when you study organic and inorganic chemistry, but at least the cycle, and I guess it's possible that there's different origins for carbon, like graphene or various things that might be carbon-based in life. So if I misspoke on that, I don't have expertise on the subject. But I think all the mainstream scientific theories on the origins of oil are centered around them being a decomposition of life. There are other theories that are not mainstream. In terms of oil trading, it doesn't matter. So the oil traders are more concerned with the location and the size of the various reserves. And to assume that the reserves are kind of bottomless, there is disputations. And I think the reason for the chart and in the hard time finding a combination between supply and demand has been the change in technology. One thing, the reserves have proven to be much bigger than before was estimated, and there does appear to be oil deeper and deeper into the earth that was unclear before. But as we've drilled deeper and deeper, we found that oil could be quite deep, and they've came up with methods to use lesser quality of oil, like shale oil and fracking and these type things. So it's not necessarily before, when we didn't have the technology to harvest that oil and make it useful, now we do. And there's also a dollar point. So at $30 an hour, $30 a barrel, could be fracking is not energy efficient, but at $60 a barrel, then it's economically efficient to extract oil through fracking. So the cheaper oil prices could actually have a negative effect on these technologies that we have only largely been doing because the price of oil was much higher. And the largely it's reduced travel, the decrease in oil prices to the decreased demand from decreased travel, decreased shipping, and for Saudi Arabia and Russia to be waging an economic war it could be strategic, saying Saudi Arabia, they got to play their cards that they're dealt. And if Saudi Arabia think it's beneficial to do what they're doing now, it makes sense that they're doing it because, they got to play the hand that's dealt to you. So in terms of Saudi Arabia being able to achieve global dominance or something, it would have to be an occasion like this where they would be able to manipulate the oil market and, somehow control the world's economy through doing that.
Yeah, it sort of makes me wonder to what extent this hinges on the petrodollar, because it seems like a lot of this speculative investment into shale and fracking is hinging on the fact that oil is traded in petrodollars. So this development with Russia and Saudi Arabia makes me wonder, like, is this the end of the petrodollar? Does it go out with a whimper, or how exactly does that monopoly get broken? Do you have any thoughts or
Well,
speculation?
the price of oil is determined in the energy markets. The energy markets are largely in New York or Chicago. That the open market will set the price of the oil, and that's done in the dollar. In the dollar, if it's represented the U.S. military, that the U.S. military is the main controller, at least military might-wise, of keeping the global supply chain freely flowing. So in that sense, and what's the most important worldwide commodity? It's oil. So hence the petrodollar, where you have the necessity of saying, how is it possible that this oil is mined and harvested and safely shipped all over the world? And it's because of the strength of the U.S. Army, and that the U.S. Army would use its power in order to defend against a disruption in the global flow of oil. And the price is set in the currency of that military power, and the global economy is doubly based on that. So even if you're an opponent to America, like possibly let's say China or Russia or Saudi Arabia or any of these things, it's the too big to fail type thing, where
Yeah.
if the U.S. Global might power waned, then you'd have no guarantee of safety of the global petrol supply chain. So, to risk a disruption in the power structure, that some new power would step up and defend the global petrol supply chain, is a lot of uncertainty, making it seem that let's just stay with the status quo and we'll have the U.S. doing it in the petrodollar till now and forever, when in reality, like something like coronavirus or some, global size event will likely disrupt the status quo and force a more efficient system. And God forbid, that could be what we're seeing right now, and it could be good in many ways, but it will probably, God forbid, require a substantial amount of suffering to change such a smoothly operated institute. That's why I was telling Gandalf about America and our institutes. Like, relatively, we have very resilient institutions in terms of maintaining minimal functionability, and that's true with the petrodollar. Is that there's somewhat of maintenance and trust in the system, that no matter what happens, somehow the global flow of petrol will still be there, and our most important commodity, mainly oil, will be there. And even you yourself, wherever you are, chances are, oil is probably the single most important commodity to you.
Yeah, lots of good points there. The way I'm looking at it, like, do you ever try to just visualize the entire world economy at one time as a sort of really complex machine? Because sometimes I try to do that and it's almost too complicated to perceive all at once. But from what I could see, there
You
appears to
never
be
traded stocks. I'm saying that's
yeah,
exactly what you do.
exactly.
That's
I'd
exactly
have
what
to
you do
try.
when you. That's
I'd have to
exactly what you
trade
do when you
stocks.
trade oil, because the price of oil, it's what I talk about karma being somewhat related to money, but all of the supply and demand pressure, because the price is at the end of the day determined by the equilibrium between supply and demand, but that will come down to a single given price, and that single given price will move up and down based on whether there's more supply or demand. And if you're a trader, by feeling those very quick fluctuations between differences in supply and demand, you could make significant amounts of money. But in terms of like that karmatic function, if you're sitting there on the commodity exchange monitoring, one thing, it has, the receipt of all the transactions of everyone buying and selling barrels of oil. That's what's causing the price to move up and down. So like you really do have your pulse on the global oil market if you're trading it.
Wow. How long did you do that for?
Only like 6 months. I wasn't that successful at it. I was successful years ago as a NASDAQ stock trader. And then after school, I tried it again, and I didn't end up even reaching trading a live account. But I followed the oil markets for a good few months and was studying it and was shadow trading it.
Cool. Yeah, just trying to understand exactly because it seems like there's a bit of a double bind between China and the US that is really hard to sort of foresee what will be the outcome, because I kind of feel like China's stuck in a way because they've become the global manufacturer to a large extent, but they've also experienced an increase in wealth, growing middle class. And because globalism essentially has no country and these international companies are just looking for the cheapest labor a lot of the time, won't that mean that China sort of is going to have a loss? I guess it's hard for me to exactly understand, like, how does China remain a big player if it's going to be decoupling from the US dollar because so much of its success is based on the strength of the US dollar, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Well, I mean, there's different schools of economics, but if you want to try to reduce it to essentially everything is just a function of supply and demand, and money is just the medium of transfer, then it's not really about the money, it's about the supply and demand. And as long as there's demand for Chinese manufactured products and they keep on supplying it, their economy will work out on their own. Like it'll naturally reach an equilibrium point. Although you do have to factor in that supply and demand is mediated through this medium of money, and money, despite its minimal effect of just being a medium to negotiate this supply and demand, becomes a science in and of itself that could effectuate things that are different than just the natural balance of supply and demand.
Yeah, that's where it gets even more complicated for me, and why I was confused that all these companies offshored the labor in the first place, though I understand a little bit better now what was happening. But I mean, China's selling mostly to the quote first world. If the first world's economy collapses, who is going to provide the demand for China's manufacturing?
Yeah, and you could add on to that the monetary aspect where China is lending us, say the US and Canada, but mostly the US money. China is lending us money in order that we could buy their products, because we're not only spending all the money we have to buy these products, largely coming to China, we're borrowing money to buy these products, and we've ran out of people to borrow the money, so we're actually borrowing the money that we pay China for these products. They're not necessarily like putting that money straight into their economy. They're borrowing that money back to us so that we could buy even more products from them, and hence our debt, is becoming increasingly owned by China itself.
Yeah, it does appear that they believe that there's a certain stability in the West, and you see that in all the investments in real estate in Canada, and I'm sure the U.S. as well, from basically Chinese wanting to offshore their money because they feel those investments are safer long term. You get another demonstration of the interreliance of these markets. Bob Elvis says it seems the nationalist countries are doing better with more proactive measures against Corona. Duvid, do you think that this coronavirus thing is going to have a massive change on how people feel about globalism and immigration?
Um, a little bit, but I think what's going to happen is that um, it's just going to close the border. Saying like there's not going to be an immigration pushback against closing the border for coronavirus, and once the border's been closed for this, it'll be easier to close for just immigration, and it could decrease the demand Yeah, my assessment is it's greatly going to shift the immigration debate, not necessarily because of logic and reason, but just because people were like, you couldn't do it even if you wanted to. And you're saying, look, we did it, because of coronavirus, we just halted immigration for a month. It can be done.
Oh yeah, I never thought about that. I just wanted to come back real quick to the petrol stuff. What do you think the global demand is for oil? Isn't it kind of like infinite? Isn't it only limited by people's disposable income? Like, won't they always spend money on these petro products if given the opportunity? It kind of seems that way.
Well, yeah, I'm saying presumably, it, if supply was infinite, but that's why you have increase in price, because there's not enough for everybody to fulfill all of their material fantasies. And it's like, yes, if everybody could have 10 cars and a mansion and so on and so on, and just burn electricity so they could keep the temperature warm in the winter and cool in the summer, and so on and so on, and just have all their amenities met, largely due to oil, carbon, providing them electricity to fund it. There's not enough. We know there's not enough, at least for current technological understanding, to go around. It has to be limited, and that limitation is largely set by the price of oil. That the oil becomes a luxury as it becomes more and more expensive. That poor people have to skimp on it. Where God forbid, if you thought you're in the situation of not having enough money, to consider not heating your place to a place of even healthy comfortability because of financial loss. And if oil's not particularly expensive, saying, okay, it's an expense, just like driving, it's an expense, but still people could drive, they could put a little gas in their car. But as things get more expensive, it's one of those things that are considered regressive, that it hurts poor people more than rich people, because poor people will have to spend more and more percent of the money that they have towards these things. And the wealthier people, though, might eat a larger portion out of their budget, it won't reach the point where they have to choose, between like actions, like how much could they spend on, driving and heat, as compared to food and the other necessities of life. So Trump, to some extent, was doing good because he kept oil prices down. So it's ironic that generally it should be a good thing that oil prices are lower, but not in this case, because the low oil price is just indicative of extremely low global economic demand, and it's unclear how it's going to be seen, because there hasn't, even during like global war or World War II, it's unclear when the last time there's been this disruption to the global economy. And it could be good, like a reshuffle, and we'll be able to rework it because we slowed it down. And things like immigration or something where like it can't be done, you can't close the border, but now you showed that yes, you can close the border. And the global trade market, where it's like, what happens if we just slowed everything down for a few days, and everyone's like, the world would come to an end, it'd be World War III, Armageddon. But like coronavirus does show, like, yes, you could shut everything down for a few days, and you could even take like a spiritual message. Like me and Deshaun were saying, like we're largely like very into cleanliness, washing hands, hygiene type things. And so coronavirus in that way is like, thank God for coronavirus. Like I don't want anyone to suffer, um, or be in pain or sick. However, thank God that it's causing people to take cleanliness more seriously. And you could say that might have a lot of reverberations where really, minus the, God forbid, suffering that had to be included, think, coronavirus will have multiple good outcomes, that will be a result of the disruption it caused.
Yeah, that reminds me of the news I saw recently where Bibi Netanyahu was suggesting people do the
Namaste.
namaste there. I thought that was pretty interesting. And I was just thinking about what you're saying, like just how much people's beliefs affect their actions and their market choices. And I'm just thinking, if people suddenly believed en masse that oil was renewable, do you think that would change that would have a massive social repercussion? I feel like it would.
Well,
I feel like people would be shocked to hear that or to believe that. But I mean, it's just one model versus another. Who knows what people will believe?
well, I mean, from the terms of the price and how much we use it, whether I don't think you say it's renewable when you're saying like how deep the reserves are. You're saying renewable, just meaning that there's a carbon cycle, and that however much you use, the carbon cycle will eventually return it, and part of this carbon cycle will be that it returns to oil. But I don't know if that makes it renewable. That's renewable generally means like organic in a way, like life, like corn is renewable, or even if you said solar and wind are renewable, it could happen daily, versus saying the carbon cycle makes it renewable. I'm not sure that'd be accurate.
Well,
If
people are
you're
just
saying
going to
the
keep looking.
reserves, if you're
People are
saying
just
the
going to keep
reserves in
looking,
the
and
core,
somebody might be able to come up with a model of how graphite could mix up underground and where it's very hot and form crude oil, right? You could make a model because there's so much carbon.
Let's say that whether it's renewable or not may or may not affect the price, because the price is just saying how much does it cost, how much of the demand and how much does it cost to get it out of the earth, and whether there's a huge amounts in the earth's core or not, depending on the difficulty of extracting it, whether it's renewable or not may not have any effect on its price.
Maybe, but if people know that it's renewable, isn't that going to change how much influence it's going to have, like how much its price will change on the market, because people will know that it's renewable, so there won't be any like scarcity
It would be
panic.
factored in. So I mean, once you say it was renewable, like what does it mean and how long does it take to renew? And that would be factored into the price and the demand. And the question is, does it renew as fast as the demand? If it's something like corn, and you say like, yeah, each year, like we renew enough corn to meet the demand.
Yeah.
But if it doesn't renew as fast as the demand keeps on continuing, the fact that it's renewable will just slow down the eventual complete using up of it. It's like it's only renewable if it renews on an annual basis more than's consumed.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, it's possible that. Have you ever seen
compared to wind and solar, that like wind and solar, to the extent that it doesn't diminish the supply at all. The fact that you put solar panels or wind didn't diminish the sun or the wind at all, as opposed to oil. It's unlikely to be renewable in that way, and it's likely that whatever we use, even if the carbon cycle eventually renews it, that we're using it at a much faster rate than it'll be renewed. So I think your terminology of saying it's renewable is misleading, if not purposely. That it might not.
I'm not trying to be purposely misleading. I'm putting it out as an alternative theory based on what I was observing in the markets. It seemed very strange that the price of oil seemed so very decoupled from anything. It appeared to be.
Well, because the price of oil, I mean, one thing, the science of the determination, like if you're an oil trader and you had a basic, there's a few different numbers. There's the proven oil reserves, then there's speculative oil reserves, and there's grades of oil reserves. So your proven oil reserves, like in Saudi Arabia, you have estimates of like, how many trillion, gallons of oil or whatever, that so to say have been tested through geological sound waves or whatever methods, that they're certain that within certain geographical amount underground is a certain amount of oil, and hence if they pump out certain amount, this will be how long it takes to disappear. If you're saying it's renewable at whatever rate that it renews, is almost guaranteed to be significantly slower than the rate that it is taken out at. And if you're saying that there's further reserves, the further you go into the ground, there are people that hold that, but that doesn't mean that once you empty the oil reserves that are closer to the ground, that automatically the oil that's further into the ground is going to like sprout up and go to the places where it had been previously extracted. Like, so no, it's going to remain where it is, and it means you have to go deeper and deeper into the ground to get those oil reserves. And at any point, like eventually, presumably there will be a limit to that, but there is, a huge unknown about, how deep in the surface can you find oil. And as of now, as technology has allowed us to go deeper, we have continued to find more and more oil, and that's why oil prices go down. And also the technology to extract it has gotten better. And from lower grade places where the amount of usable oil is much less, has also we found methods to be able to extract that. In terms of like Canada, they have huge amounts of like shale oil, and even if the shale oil in Canada, is like only 1/25th as good as the oil in Saudi Arabia, you could still profitably go through a refinement process to turn that shale oil into usable oil. And that's what you're doing. That's like the Keystone oil pipeline is processed oil, and that's in competition. But I said that's also interesting related to the dollar amount, because let's say to convert shale oil into usable oil, costs $45-50 comparative per gallon. And if you could buy the gallon for $30 from Saudi Arabia, it doesn't pay to go through this whole complicated process, because the price has been over $50-60 a barrel for a long period of time. We've been using these fracking and shale technologies, but long term, should there be less demand for oil and the oil price of oil drop, it could be that we could discontinue these practices that we've been doing here. But likely it's only once the coronavirus is over, we're going to kick right back into peak demand and everybody wanting everything right now.
Yeah. How long do you think this panic will last?
I mean, as long as there's mass casualty. So it looks like the mass casualty in China's came to an end. So, that means if it took about a 4-month period for the mass casualty to happen in China, if it's, not as bad or anywhere else, like it should be over in a few months. If God forbid, there's a mass casualty, in Italy or somewhere else as bad as it was in China, you could predict it to go about the same amount of time, another 3 months. Or God forbid, there could be another mass casualty event that is worse than in China, and it could continue to spread and get worse. So you have to embrace for that possibility. But as of now, I guess it's still unclear. It's unclear whether the precautions are too much and unnecessarily hampering activity and trade, or God forbid. But I think as of now, it's unclear, what I'm saying, because the mass casualty increase happened in Italy, and God forbid that if that happened in France or somewhere else, where all of a sudden you have 100 people dying a day, and then if that could be, God forbid, across the U.S., where if you had 100 people dying a day in the U.S., or it was even replicated, like you had 100 people dying in multiple major population centers every day, that could basically halt almost all global activity, communal activity, where we just have to hunker down and wait it out. But I could assume, God forbid, the human race hasn't done it for a while, but we could go through a mass bloodletting where even 10-20% of the population died out, and saying this one's not even close. You're saying it's 2% of the population that's about dying for this. So even if there was nothing we could do, and eventually all of humanity is going to get it, and that means that 2% of humanity is going to die out. You think that's a pretty big hit to humanity, but what would happen after? How would we go on if this virus went on to fully wipe out 2% of humanity?
Yeah, lots of things to think about. There's a comment in the chat. Dependence on oil is a big problem. It doesn't have energy density to get our civilization to the next level. We aren't seeing much technological change because being locked into the oil economy. Do you think there's any truth to that? That other technology is being suppressed in the interest of oil development?
No, it's what he said about the energy density. There's nothing that compares to the energy density of oil. And so to make it transportable, easy to use, the renewable, cleaner technologies do not meet the current demands. Nuclear had been a possibility, but after Fukushima, nuclear has become less popular. In fact, I don't know if a single nuclear facility, has at least been newly built to be built since Fukushima. So
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a question in the chat from Harshit Pant. Do we think that Trump will use this to declare emergency, cancel election, and become a dictator of sorts?
yeah, I'm scared of that, like coronavirus. That next thing you know, there's going to be, it's just going to be an excuse for the government to take more power. In terms, I think someone's asking here, like Israel, other countries that have more totalitarian governments have an easier time, quarantining, forcing people into it, than the U.S. government, where it's unclear how much the government can force their own citizens to do, even in the case of emergency. And even if like a lot of states have declared national emergencies, so New York had to declare a state of emergency, but like Charlottesville, like the Richard Spencer, David Duke declared a state of emergency for that. So you say, okay, they declared a state of emergency. The federal government now globally, the United Nations has declared a global state of emergency. Legally, that's a precursor to take human rights away from you. So the Court of International Human Rights, there's your basic minimum requirements, kind of like your no-heightism, but your minimal requirements of human rights. And then there's temporary situations where you're allowed to take away, God forbid, some of those human rights due to state of emergency situations. So you want to be extremely careful about the government declaring a state of emergency, because largely a state of emergency gives your own government the legal rights to take away your human rights. So I would be extremely wary of that. And you'll think that it's general cleanliness, common sense. They're using the new term social distance or something like that. So these type things, it's unlikely that you need your civil rights, your human rights, temporarily suspended in order that the government saves you from this.
Yeah, it's the first time I thought about that, but that's kind of scary. We got a link in the chat shared by King Kush for a prediction tool of the pandemic outbreak. It's not giving me any examples to share here, but people are welcome to check that out. He shared it in the chat.
You could also
Yeah,
become
really.
like they declared deployed the National Guard in that Orthodox Jewish area in New Rochelle, where I was mentioning on the Sunday in Weekend Review, and they're largely using them to disinfect places and distribute food. But once you think, okay, it's been a state of emergency, and we're deploying the army in order to help out with quarantines, and you think, okay, that's just the precedent. Just like no one thought you could close the border, for immigration. But Trump, he just said, like, I'm going to closing down immigration 100% until we figure out what it means to be American, who we want here in our country. You think that's impossible. But now coronavirus, we got closed borders. So in the same sense, like no one thought you could declare a state of emergency and have like armed army and troops, stationed all over America. But then all of a sudden, the coronavirus and everyone's like, oh, look, of course, declare a state of emergency and bring in the army in order to help us. And but that could be creating a dangerous precedent. So generally, I'm against. I think if we're going to beat coronavirus, we're going to beat it collectively as citizens, and bringing the government to force us to do it is largely a sign of the citizens being unable to deal with it. And if citizens are unable to deal with it, trying to have the government force that upon the people could just couple the problem.
Yeah, that's true, because they still don't exactly know how this thing is spreading. So by attempting to contain it, they could actually accidentally spread it more. So yeah, it's really tough because I just like can't make any. I don't want to make any judgments and end up being wrong, and it's so hard to validate the information that I'm seeing. So I'm just recommending that people do their best for bodily cleanliness and avoid any unnecessary shaving. Because I was thinking like the cuts from shaving could be a really easy vector of ingress for the disease, and it's a very easy.
You could even avoid unnecessary gatherings or mass gatherings. Certainly entertainment or unnecessary, and say like there is a likely time frame. Like God forbid, they think the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 or whatever that killed tens of millions of people was done over one season. A lot of viruses are seasonal, and have less than a year life, so it's already been 4 months. And also globally, it's basically near traverse the whole globe. Like from China to North America and all parts of the world that could be halfway through its life. And if we take precautions to slow its measurement, something that might have killed a few 100,000 people might only kill thousands or tens of thousands of people. And the questions of how much we limit our daily activities and economics is the question of how willing are we to is it worth paying the price of hundreds of thousands of lives in order to keep our economy and society functioning at the rate that we've been doing it.
Thanks for your input there. Really appreciate that. It really helps give me a lot of context for these questions. There's somebody in the chat, Illuminati Socrates, asking whether we think high-profile individuals are getting it by accident. I guess there has been reports that Tom Hanks has contracted the virus, and he's listed Mike Pence, Trump, and Pope. I'm not so sure if those have been confirmed or not. Have you followed this at all?
Yeah, I did notice that, and there could be some connection between like globalism, traveling, and germ spreading, and wealth, or fame, or it could be random, like Orthodox Jews in North America, where it's unclear if it just randomly came to an Orthodox Jew, and then once they're spread quickly due to the communal behavior, or if there's any rhyme or rhythm to it. And it could also most likely just be that wealthier people have better medicine and better healthcare and are quicker to get diagnosed. So otherwise, you're having your cases where people are sick, they're in the hospital, and they're just not getting better. And then eventually, you're figuring out it's coronavirus, as opposed to people that probably in close proximity of doctors all the time. And even if they have a tiny symptom of feeling sick, immediately have expert doctors that are likely to be able to diagnose something quickly, and that would add to the fear that the amount of people who have coronavirus is significantly higher than being reported, and it's only people that relatively have good health care that are able to get a diagnosis like that.
Yeah, a lot of uncertainties. We've got some intel coming into the chat. I don't know how to validate this. I just looked it up real quick. But South Korea significantly reducing lethality of coronavirus by prescribing a chloroquine diphosphate salt and zinc treatment to block the COVID. So I'll make you moderator. Can you share a link for that? Because I haven't been able to find any link to that. I've looked it up a little bit. I think I just found it, so I'll throw it up there, just keeping in mind that I haven't looked at this yet. So we have researchgate.net, remdesivir and chloroquine effectively inhibit the recently emerged novel coronavirus in vitro. So PDF available in Cell Research, February 2020. So this is a developing story. We'll continue to monitor this. Would be interesting if there turned out to already be a cure that was readily available, though. That would be really good news.
Well, if it's a cure or treatment, in terms if there's a chemical that inhibits the effect of it, and then someone could be infected and had limited or no effect, versus something that was like an antibiotic that actually killed or defeated the virus, or something like like the AIDS, so to say, treatments that in essence the person still suffers, but suffers minimally from it. And I know, like Israel, the Jewish papers keep on claiming that Israel has a cure, but they've actually been saying that a few weeks now. And as I said, a treatment that just slows down the effect of it, that people could attempt to market as a cure.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's hard to say because I saw that come out not too long ago, but I haven't heard anything about anybody. Has it been validated? It doesn't sound like it has, this treatment for it.
No, I mean, I think it's just speculation, or someone gave a statement to an Israeli paper, and whether it was true or anything. And it said what you posted the link was unclear. Whether it didn't sound like it was like a cure, it sounded like it was some sort of inhibitor that inhibited, or either maybe completely inhibited or just slowed the effects of it through the use of some chemical, as opposed to something that inhibited the spread or growth of the virus, or even killed the virus.
Yeah, it sounds like it's just something that inhibits the growth. I don't know if it's an actual cure, but good to keep the information coming, and we'll check it out when we can. Try to give the best information that we have, but you have to understand it's very hard to validate a lot of this stuff. We don't want to speak incorrectly, so just give you the information as we see it, and hopefully.
According to the New York Times, there is a note that according to the New York Times, I think they have relatively few deaths. So on the map they have 7,700 cases in South Korea and only 60 deaths, as opposed to like Italy that has 12,400 deaths, or even Spain that only has 2,255 deaths, or the United States that only has 1,250 and is already at 37 deaths. So South Korea's percentage of deaths per infections is quite low. So if you're telling me that's because South Korea is using this as an inhibitor and that's causing less deaths, that could be an interesting explanation, because just looking at the chart, South Koreans are factually dying from this less than most other nations.
Yeah, and we just have to kind of be careful with these preliminary numbers coming out. We don't actually know what the infection rate is in Italy, right? It could be substantially higher than what they're reporting. I mean, don't you expect the lethality and mortality rate to more or less be the same everywhere, unless there was some reason for it to be different?
There could be many reasons for it to be different: climate, environmental, dietary, racial, your previous immunities from different viruses, to like multiple things. But no, I mean, viruses affecting different nations at different rates, I think, is a common thing, and it just shows the genetic diversity among people and environmental diversity around the world could have substantial effects on things like viruses.
Yeah, I guess one thing that could affect it is proximity. People live to each other. If they were living in closer proximity, then you'd expect it to spread faster, unless there were quarantine measures in effect.
Even President Trump used that word, that like the new buzzword, social distance, which things that Europeans generally keep a further social distance anyways, and social distancing. Social distancing is the new buzzword. And that's like a type thing like Indian culture, Chinese culture, European culture, where you say you expect a certain feet around the person that the other person doesn't enter among. And generally, Europeans have the furthest social distance of other groups. So that could play a factor in terms of a lot of these outbreaks and stuff affect Europeans less than other nations, because they naturally have a further social distance.
Yeah, so it's been interesting to see the death rate be so high, and it's Italy, right?
Yeah, but Italy might have the less of any of the European peoples that social distance in Italy is the less.
Yeah, maybe. Isn't the social distance in China pretty low, though?
But yeah, in China, India, in Japan, some of the Philippines, their social distance is almost non-existent. It's like you could see someone like coming right in and like sitting on your lap, and it's just like like you can't. That's or the famous Indian trains or something like that. Or even just going to Iskon Temple and sitting there, you're like the social distance between Indians and Europeans. Uh, Indians will sit much closer to each other than Europeans will.
Yeah, that's true. So, do you think it's possible the numbers coming out of China are exaggerated or under exaggerated?
Oh, the coronavirus?
Yeah, the infections and deaths.
Well, I mean, it's unclear because it looks like they got it under control and they isolated and they prevented its spread, and now it's largely under control, and that it's they are down to tens of deaths a day, and more people a day are recovering than are getting infected. At least that's how they're reporting it. But no, I don't have any expertise other than they report what's going on in China, or know better than what the news telling me. That's what Trump and a lot of the reports are saying, though, that it's basically towards the end of its cycle in China.
Just wanted to say hi to Ray of Creation real quick in the chat. Nice to see you, bud. Everybody else who showed up, who haven't had a chance to talk to you yet, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the audience questions and contributions. On a slightly different subject, Duvid, do you know who Cotto is of Cotto and Gottfried?
Yeah.
I went to a show.
Just the last few weeks.
Yeah, I've been checking out his show. He's pretty he's basically like the opposite of you. It's kind of funny. I think he's pretty cool. Like I haven't really gotten a vibe off Gottfried yet. Like I haven't read anything he's written or seen anything he said that was particularly compelling, but I like Cotto. And I actually asked him what he thought about your hypothesis about a military coup in Israel. Would you like me to play his response?
Sure. Yeah, I guess I saw him a few times, but I didn't have enough interest to check it out regularly. But sure.
All right, cool. If you don't mind muting, I'll just play it right now.
But it's one that I am glad to undertake. Church of Entropy says, do you follow Israel politics? Yes, I do. If so, how do you estimate the probability of a military coup which would put Benny Gantz in power? It's not going to happen. Benjamin Netanyahu is the representative of the Israeli right. The Israeli right, as with the American right, has many different factions. Unlike in America, though, in Israel, each faction of the right has its own party. The biggest party of the right is called the Likud, which is a catch-all, really. It's a very populist, sort of Trump-like deal before Trump was around in politics, at least. And the Israeli establishment, which tends to be on the left, actually, does not like this, even though the Israeli public is very much on the right. Trump is fanatically popular in Israel, as is the Republican Party. So I don't think that a military coup would occur, though. It'd be too risky for the people who would undertake it. I don't think that would end well at all for them. So, but it's a good question. Definitely a good question. Thank you for asking it, Church of Entropy. Tangies, speaking on the left in American society, they played a huge role in advancing this stuff, but at the same time, there's a difference between playing a role in advancing it and actually starting it. Big difference. Church of Entropy said, thanks, Cotto Gottfried. I asked Liz Duvid, who is also interested in Israel politics, believes a military coup is a possibility. due to the inability to form a coalition. It's a possibility, but I just don't think it'll happen. I think that would be, it would be it would be too much negative attention for the military, and I think they're in the Israel right now, especially with the coronavirus there and Netanyahu's general popularity. I just can't see the military doing that. OHM7 says, is it true that Israel's been importing more?
And we're back. Thanks for bearing with us during that brief interlude there. All right. So he said negative attention for the military. I'm just wondering from who, and did you have any thoughts on his answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think he might be not as realistic about the current state of Israel to assume that's not possible. Although he did say, it was possible. And the first time you asked it, I didn't think that there would be a military coup to put Gantz in power. I thought the purpose of the military coup would be to dissolve the parliament, that the military would just determine that the parliament is not necessary and dissolve that. And, exactly who would do it, whether it be Gantz and Netanyahu together or a different faction, or if it'd just be due to long-term inability to form a government, and because the military is the most respected, stable structure in Israel. And then you even look at coronavirus, like Israel has taken relatively extreme measures, 14-day travel ban, quarantine on anyone entering the country. They have over 80,000 people in quarantine. And it's largely because Israel is already a military state. So the coronavirus, could be an extreme exertion of military power, where you see the military is basically directing everything across Israel because they've taken over the coronavirus, outbreak response, and it could provide a venue for just the military directing affairs of the state. And it'd be a point that who's going to stop them? That's the main point of why the military would do it, because they'll see that there is no exterior party, that there's no one within Israel that they have to answer to, and that there's in reality no one outside of Israel that they really have to answer to either.
Yeah, interesting take. He runs some pretty interesting streams. I mean, they're mostly chill streams, so that they might not be exciting enough for you. But one thing I like about him is he answers pretty much. He responds pretty much every single thing in the chat, which is
he does a good
cool.
chance. He does a very good job of that, and he's got about the right size of it, to do that. And he's relatively well thought out and knowledgeable to basically field questions, across the spectrum. So props to him for doing that, and props to you for asking him that. And we'll see how dire, because obviously a military coup in Israel would be an extreme break of status quo. And but I thought already when they entered the third election that we're approaching that level in Israel. And I think with coronavirus and fourth elections and possibly all this like Bernie Sanders type stuff, that the Israeli patience will wear off. And as you see the Israeli patience wear off, you'll see that they'll act more like Middle Eastern nations than of your expectations of how you might expect Jews in the West or Western nations to act. And that means, military coup, related to the region that they're in these various things. And it might be Cato's bias to be like, no, Jews are enlightened Westerners. They would never have a military coup, even though all the nations right next to them have already done such a thing.
Yeah, it's an interesting take. So I take it there hasn't been any development on the inability to form a coalition there. They're still got their heels dug in as regards to whether the Haredi should serve a mandatory military service, as I understand is one of the major issues of friction.
Yeah, and it looks like it's gotten worse, that the Arabs picked up a seat. And, because if the Arabs all voted Arab Party, the Arabs maybe could even have as many as 30 seats. But now, they're up to 15, which means that like almost half of the Arabs are voting for Arab parties. And it took another seat away from Netanyahu's right coalition, that, he's further away from a government, and he's got like these fantasies about convincing people to defect and join him. And Gantz has these fantasies when, the math seems pretty clear that there's not going to, it's just a complete standstill. And there is nothing, because you have the Arabs the nationalists from the left and the right not wanting to include Arabs among a Jewish nationalistic government, and that is basically universal among the Jewish right and the left. And then you have the Haredim not serving in the military, which is a big issue on the left. Ironically, the issue of mandatory military service for the Haredim is a bigger issue on the left than the right. But the Lieberman Russian coalition of the right has shown that they will not compromise on the Haredim military exemption issue. So it appears just to be a complete standstill. Plus, issues like the Haredim at all, how the Haredim are controlling more and more of Jewish life and what it means to be Jewish, even though the mass of Israeli society is secular. Plus, the welfare state, where the Haredim use the power to increase the welfare and be able to continue to be selected, and hence use the government to really increase their gain and just allow them to be selected for a few more years has a massive effect on the demographic shift. So if they keep the Netanyahu coalition, that means that the government will be funding these selected activities as long as Netanyahu is prime minister. So there's a whole bunch of interesting factors, and maybe Kato is inclined to just believe that that is going to be stable, as where Duvid is just looking like this is already extremely unstable. Something's going to happen. The system is just beyond the ability to not have disaster with how unstable it is.
I guess it's easy to sort of take I think the whole democracy thing is itself a fallacy, like that numbers matter, but I can imagine that the vibe on the ground amongst the more secular Jews might be increasingly, like you say, uncomfortable because this minority is sort of seen to have more or less the final say in a lot of these policies. So you're saying right now
they're
that
coming to a point where they don't pay taxes, they don't serve the military, they become like a permanent welfare taker of the state, and all the policy is increasingly directed in their favor. So if you're like a secular Israeli Jew, it's became increasingly annoying to the point where that's your major issue. Your biggest issue is the demand that these people have to serve in the army like everybody else. And so that and that's on the left. So ironically, that's the unifying issue of the left is mandatory service for the Haredim.
Well, that's interesting. I guess it's
So it's such a broken system that the dynamics are coming at ways that you wouldn't even expect. That it's the left that's more militaristic in that way, and just it's but meanwhile the Haredim control the housing ministry and the education ministry, and huge amounts of government funding continue to be, as this coalition fails to form and Netanyahu is still prime minister, the Haredim are still in charge of housing, health, and education, and continue to even like coronavirus and these things, there'll be a continued disproportionate amount of money spent among Haredim, even though they're the smallest contributor to the tax base.
I guess this is coming from the left because they're maybe more egalitarian, and they see the compulsory military service as like a measure of fairness. It's hard to really get an idea of exactly where they're coming from, but the left are the ones that make the alliances with the Arab parties, right?
No, the left has refused to make alliances with Arab parties. That's why the left has basically no chance of forming a coalition. So, it's just a complete standstill. It doesn't appear, either the left would have to include the Arabs in their coalition, or Lieberman would have to drop his demand for the Haredim to have mandatory military service, and both of them have said that absolutely not. So we enter a period where they might soon have to call forth elections. The question comes, when does something extremely unlikely like the military just stepping in and disbanding the government, and polled, the military is by far the most popular institution in Israel. It's even like 80+% approval rating, as where the political class and Israel has very low approval rating. Even Netanyahu, relatively, his approval rating is much lower than the military's approval rating in general.
Well, good for the military, I guess.
Well, if you want to be a military state, and that's what I'm saying, Duvid, God forbid, is making the negative prediction that Israel will become just a straight out military state that doesn't even have the remnants of democracy anymore.
Well, when you present the evidence that way, it almost seems like an inevitability just based solely on their popularity. What did you say? 80% approval rating? That's very high. Higher than any other institution, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, Cato would definitely know these things. So he said, like, these facts that I'm giving that point towards it. And he didn't rule out that it was a possibility, but a remote possibility. And, I don't know if he would have accepted that, however remote the possibility increases the longer that Israel can't form a government.
Maybe he's thinking that it's, or subconsciously thinking it's somehow connected to the line of Israel being the only democracy in the Middle East, and that somehow meaning something. I think it means more in Europe than it does in the Americas, but they would lose.
It's a fundamental, probably positive view towards Jews that, like, probably comes from a Western ethnocentrism of favoring the West, and that the Jewish people, that democracies are a superior form of government, and certainly the Jewish people would be capable of setting up democracy, even though possibly the Palestinian people might not be civilized enough to really thrive under a democracy. And so just a simple kind of like, yeah, I'm a Jew, I like Jews. Jews are definitely capable of setting up a thriving democracy, even though all peoples might not be able to, in saying that, well, maybe you're wrong. Maybe Jews are not capable of setting up a functional democracy. And you're seeing that just like the Arab countries and the other countries in the region, that, Jews will also resort into a military dictatorship.
I wouldn't feel too bad about it, Duvid. I sincerely doubt this democracy idea ever had any real staying power. Because, I mean, what would it take for democracy?
I would say also that's the difference between Cato as an American Jew and as Israeli, that your average Israeli wouldn't feel too bad about it either. Like your average American, just be like, yo, Duvid, only an anti-Semite could even think of that. But from your point of view, Israeli perspective, I think that, the reason why it is reasonably likely that Israel could become a military, dictatorship is because relatively Israelis could probably have a relatively high functioning society and continuance to how they function now as a military dictatorship, as opposed to American Jews that can't even fathom that possibility.
Yeah, there's so much propaganda in the West pro-democracy, and there's so much separation between the non-democratic states and the democratic ones in the United States versus Israel. Like, I'm just imagining if I were a Jew living in Israel, I'm like surrounded pretty much by what do they call themselves? They call themselves military dictatorships, or I'm not too familiar with how these countries around Israel identify.
Well, I mean, Jordan is technically a constitutional monarchy, and I think they're all probably, technically some form of democracy. So like all the military dictatorships promote themselves as a democracy in some way or have some sorts of elections, but from a different perspective, it's like how democratic they are and how strong the military is. Just like in Israel, where most Jews have already served in the military, as opposed to an American Jew who never served in the military. It just structures society in a different way, where you have a trust of power versus skepticism and cynicism of power, and it
also order. Also, personal organization and order. I think military service instills a certain sense of order into a person's life.
That, and it's tough to call, but yeah, I'm glad you understood and you're able to ask it, and you'll see, Kyle at least recognize the possibility. Could be your question hit him with a little bit of dissonance, where like maybe like a little bit of racism or something, where he'd be like, well, of course, like Jews in Israel, they're not like Iraqis. Like they're not like, just because Iraq fell into a military dictatorship, like of course Israel would never do that. They're Jews.
It's so funny. We're like all LARPing as these. I guess who was it that was big on democracy? Was it Plato or Aristotle? The whole world is LARPing as ancient Greeks at this point. I wonder when the public naked bathhouses will start. It's just starting to sound like a LARP, isn't it? Like, oh, we'll have this great idea of democracy, but now it's like, where is this democracy thing even taken us? Like, my views. I don't see democracy as a viable venue because the average person is so uninformed that their vote would be, neutral at best and deleterious at worst.
Well, it's a conspiracy theory that was largely vindicated in the last few years that there's larger corporate interests that control both sides. So democracy is largely irrelevant because the corporate or foreign or Israeli or whatever conspiracy theory someone's subscribing to largely controls both sides, both parties, regardless of the election. The fallacy of the two-party system, and even this like, okay, like I serve God and God only. I accept no authority over myself. That I'm not going to voluntarily put someone authority in charge of me. If you had like voluntary bureaucrat, public administrator as a public service, but this concept of the power and investing power, like I reject that. I have no interest in investing power over me or anybody else. And so to me, it's largely like a fallacy or bad character that people's feeling around elections is just a reflection of their own estimation of societal karma, and generally reveals people's bad character.
Yeah, I agree. The belief that the state exists to sort of prop things up or give people money to survive, I think is it's not going in a good direction, because you're not going in the direction of building the state, you're going in the direction of profiting from the state. And there's another thing to consider, is that there's a lot of multinational corporations whose decisions aren't made by a single person. They're made by often it's, what do they call them?
Shareholders?
Shareholders. It's like a group of people who either vote on issues or debate issues. I'm not exactly sure how they do it, but this is what it's coming down to. And these corporate entities, as far as I understand, are legally bound to maximize their profits. And so if there is this legal obligation, I mean, that's basically what's going to be making the decisions, because these people sitting at these shareholder meetings are the ones who ultimately decide what direction the corporation is going. And if these corporations are funding politicians on both sides, well, sure, they're not going to have anybody to oppose their will, which is just going to be towards more profits.
What's the importance of understanding the money is karma model, where you could appreciate the system that says, well, obviously money is representative of good karma. So maximizing money is like maximizing good karma, which is, somewhat a fundamental, like, let's say that, capitalism is a dharmatic system of an interpretation of reality.
Yeah, that's pretty much how they see it. If corporations are controlling democracy and corporations exist to maximize profits, then profits are the ultimate good. And so we can understand things as essentially people making educated guesses as regards what's the best direction to take things in to maximize profits. And I don't know if you saw, I forget the guy's name, but he's got like white hair and really light skin. He went on JF's. I forget his name, but he was talking about some wars going on either Asia or the Middle East, and he was talking about
Semigog.
Semigog. Sorry, did you catch that one? It was interesting because it was basically an economic model predicting this spread of warfare.
Yeah, I actually enjoyed his analysis.
Yeah, I did too. You don't see, like, I've never seen this guy before, but I find you don't see people take that strategic of an analysis. Like, he really got the whole picture in his head before he started talking, and he sort of told it like a narrative almost. I thought that was interesting. Did you think he was correct?
Well, I'm not sure. I thought, he gave over a lot of useful, correct information, whether his conclusions were correct, and he was, pretty professional, I guess, in the way that he separated his analysis from, his factual presentations.
Tretch in the chat has a question for you, Duvid. It's not clear to him if money and credit equal karma. How do you explain Epstein's rise to wealth? So I think he's having a bit of trouble understanding that what you're presenting is a model for the mainstream. You're not necessarily endorsing that model.
Well, whether I endorse or not, I'm saying it doesn't mean I couldn't argue within or explain within it. And saying, okay, certainly money and credit are not the only thing that contribute to karma, but they're possibly the most significant factor. And Epstein, using his rise to wealth, is through the creation of good karma. And just because he had a lot of bad karma doesn't mean he didn't have good karma. And in the sense of capitalism, finding it's almost like limiting suffering type thing. If there's like you could interpret that like a Ahimsa principle through suffering, that suffering is caused through market inequalities and inequilibriums where people have a product that they want and can't get, and therefore they're suffering because there's a inequilibrium in the economy where there's a divide between people what they want and what they could have. So you acquire wealth by being a conduit between what people want and and giving it to them. That's how they make money. And in a sense, like that's if you want to call that limiting suffering or acquiring good karma, but that's generally the way you make money, is by providing a product or service to people who want it and are willing to pay for it. So in terms of that, Epstein, at least if he managed well, made investments, that was a process of accumulation of good karma. And if he used that money for evil means, or that power for evil means, that's a separate calculation than how he acquired it. Or even if you look at, God forbid, Leslie Wexner of like Victoria's Secret and these things, and saying, well, that's essentially the creation of good karma, because he gave people what they wanted. He made a product that caused people to desire that product. Then he sold them that product. But in terms of some sort of model that he was decreasing suffering by giving people what they want, and that's symbolic of how he was able to increase his own personal wealth.
Thank you for that deeper explanation. We understand karma a little bit differently, and I'd be happy to explain it to you, Tretch. Ultimately, the way we understand karma is through intention. So money is a means to an end, not an end in and of itself, the way we understand it. So money would be part of the total karmatic equation, but whether it was the majority shareholder would really depend on what level of karma you were looking at, because there's different levels of it. And ultimately, where does karma come from is a question of intention. So I'm probably going to wrap up the stream pretty soon here. I see Duvid's stepped away for a minute from the camera. If anybody has any last questions for the panel. So we've got some comments in the chat, but not too many questions. Hopefully people will come with some questions soon, because I do enjoy answering audience questions. And there's a lot of stuff we could go into, a lot of big questions that hopefully some of this new information coming out, as horrible and scary as this coronavirus stuff can seem, hopefully it'll be an opportunity for greater knowledge and overall better strategy of approach, so that this stuff doesn't, these risks don't come out in to quite the same extent. Can you hear me, Duvid?
Yes, I had to check a break. Yeah, I'm gonna have to call it a night. It's almost 2:00.
Yeah, I was just wrapping it up. I just wanted to say thanks so much for stopping by. Really appreciate your contributions as usual. It's great to chat. Did you have any final words for the audience?
No, but just glad you're streaming. Glad I found caught you streaming, and you invited me on, and you talked about a few more important subjects that maybe just get hard to squeeze into the time of week in review.
Yeah, right on. So looking forward to Week in Review. And for those of you who are interested, you can catch that at 8 p.m. on Sunday, Detroit time, which is Eastern Standard. We'll be looking forward to that. Thank you again to David for joining. Thank you so much to the audience for tuning in. Really appreciate that. And we'll see you again real soon. Take care and bye-bye.